You can see the other amounts there, 62%. In 62 XX in that function for purchase, not function, object code for purchase and contracted services at 7.2%. And so you'll see that there's utilities and such in there. On the one of the questions that we had, and so it's usually 86 up into even 88% range. Okay. So looking at that budget and combining those things, so our numbers there, you can see in 16, 17, the 588 minus the 592, we plan on bringing in 1.5 million from extended learning to contribute to the bottom line. This is showing a small deficit balance of 2.3 million, which is similar to what we had actually the prior year. We adopted a budget of 2.5 in terms of a deficit last year. So getting to more of the story in regard to 15, 16, because those property values came in, so much higher than what we expected and what we had planned on, you can see that we've ended up with a sizable surplus, 9 million, and that includes the transferring out of that other sources uses. That includes transferring out of funds to the technology service fund and some of the other things that we've had planned. Okay, so getting into the fund balance strategies. I don't know if you wanted to. Do you mind speaking some on this one?
Sure. The main thing to focus on here are the new categories, and those would be the economic stabilization, and we're beefing up the new instruction. Really reversed, and that doesn't work out favorably for us in the funding formula. So what we've done is we've gone ahead and tucked some funding away to ease us through the next couple of years when we're opening 3 campuses and where we're actually decreasing in revenues while we're increasing in enrollment. So this is to kind of help us ease into the next couple of years. And
just to add to that, the picture will look different if we have a favorable legislative session in 2017. But we planned as if we aren't getting any new money. Okay, and so we've taken a prudent approach in terms of planning. The budget for 16-17. Obviously, we have no new state money, but in terms of setting aside our some actual funds and committed fund balance, this sets us up to be able to absorb opening up of the new campuses in 17-18, and assuming that the formulas stay as is and we don't get new state revenue. Okay.
So essentially, we're planning for the worst but hoping for the best.
That's right. Okay. And then sticking with those from a strategy perspective, so you could see those numbers that we had on the prior slide 14. Those committed numbers come over, so you can see those committed fund balance slides. We have the 1 month set aside per policy for the state revenue stabilization. So as our expenditures increase year over year, we need to set aside that much more in that 1 month for the state revenue stabilization. And then you can see our unassigned fund balance and how we end up with that. And so those two numbers, the state revenue stabilization, then the unassigned fund balance, our goal and what we have in policy is for that to equal at least 90 days of expenditures. And you can see through 17-18, we anticipate being within policy. So just looking at our unassigned fund balance over time, you can see that when we changed our strategy and added that 1 month for the state revenue stabilization, so we're showing that in the combined amount here, and we explained that to the rating agencies whenever we were on the calls with them, whenever we were going through our ratings for the debt issuances and such. They asked about that and what that was for, and so they definitely understood our rationale for for placing that there, and it was definitely favorably received. So these numbers are much smaller. This is for the child nutrition budget. The child nutrition budget, we're anticipating, breaking even with $28.2 million in revenue. As you can see, hopefully we won't have nearly as much to write off in collections because we've been active on that. That amount is getting closer to $300,000 when it was projected to be up to $450,000. So we are going to need to send some folks to collections, but I do think that between the collections actually happening and the courtesy meals actually happening, that I think folks are going to get the message and we'll right the ship going into the out years. And so I'm optimistic that would happen. We did have a loss in 14-15, in case you were wondering, because our fund balance was too high in child nutrition. You cannot exceed 3 months of fund balance, and so we had to bring that number down, and we used some monies to help pay for some of the cafeteria line renovations, but that was back in 14-15. But in the meantime, we'll be breaking even, and that's without a meal price increase. Okay, so I'm changing gears and getting, well, I like purple. Changing gears and getting into the debt service side. And so we did have a transaction this past month, the refunding of our 2006 bonds. So again, just to remind everybody, when you refund bonds, it's like we're refinancing our house. And so there were interest rates that we felt like on those bonds that if we go back to the market and refinance, that we'd be able to save some money, and certainly we did. Our net present value savings is at $15.1 million. That was higher than what we estimated whenever we asked the board about this. I think it was 14.8 is what we estimated at the time. The market, was favorable for us, and so that was definitely able to help us. And you can see in that savings over time, maybe on your handout, but $1.6 million each year. I mean that helps us to the tune of through those years of shaving off about half a penny of our tax rate in all of those out years. So it's always good to do those refundings. We'll have a major refunding again in 2008, significant one. The 2008 opportunity to have it on a current basis would be in 2018. Okay, so we'll be bringing refundings in the future that'll help us manage our tax rate. So on the if you look at from a debt service perspective, if you look at our projection for 16-17, we're anticipating just a small surplus of $3.1 million. If you look, including the August payment, we would be at a deficit. That's why we have to have as big of a fund balance as we have. If you look at our June 30th year, closing June 30th, that's not including that August payment. And there's not a lot of collections between June 30th and going into the August payment. And so that's why we just show you that number from an informational perspective. We do show us having a deficit as planned in 15-16, and that's to bring the fund balance down somewhat. Okay, so we've talked about our debt strategy, and we've been very successful with some of our debt management strategies, and we've had reimbursement resolutions in place. We've introduced variable rate funds, variable rate bonds, for the first time in a long time for the district, and then we've also had successful refundings, not just this one, but we've had others since we did the bond. And remember, when we did the bond, we projected that we'd be able to absorb the almost $500 million in new debt without increasing the tax rate. And again, part of that's because of debt management, but also because of the large value increases we've had. And so up until this point, we've been thinking all along that we would be able to absorb a reduction of 2 pennies on the INS tax rate. And so if you look at this is this chart, and we showed last time we met. This is the chart that was also in the Truth in Taxation publication that was actually published 10 days prior to this meeting. Whenever we give notice to the public that we are going to have a budget hearing, we go through the Truth in Taxation calculations, and part of it is this table where it does show what is the impact to the average taxpayer of the tax rate that's being proposed. And so the way this reads, so you have the average market value. You can see what was published for last year. The average market value is 256. Now the average market value is up to 274. The taxable value is when you take the exemptions away. And so before we had an exemption that wasn't as high. Now we have the prior amounts for the no, that does include it, doesn't it? Yeah, this does include the new exemption from that was voted on last November, the additional $25,000 per homestead. But you can see that last year the average home taxpayer with a tax rate of $1.34 would have been spending $880.81 rounding. That's what they would have paid on an average basis. So if you look at what the calculation would be, if we did drop the 2 pennies, you could see an increase of about $19 per month for our taxpayer. And the frustrating thing about this is, and this is when I got into the discussion with the reporter whenever we were talking about the school funding lawsuit, is that our average taxpayer is in fact going to be spending, whether or not, even if we reduce our tax rate down to $1.32, the average taxpayer would be spending 8% more, okay? But yet on the general fund side, our revenue per student is actually going down 1.3%. Okay, and so it's something that's very it's difficult for people to understand. It's frustrating for folks, but that's really the way it is. So that was really when just to go into our discussion on the lawsuit. I think that was the thing I was most surprised about on the lawsuit, because if you think about that concept, it really isn't, just in my opinion, a statewide property tax, because we're not benefiting from the increase in the taxes being paid by our taxpayers. Now, I think the technicality is that money is in fact being sent to Fort Bend County, and they do give it to us. And so I guess technically it isn't a statewide property tax, but what happens though is that because we are collecting more, the state then just sends us that much less on a per student basis. And so that was the thing I was most surprised about with regard to the lawsuit. Of course, everybody knows that we lost on all counts in terms of none of the tenants with regard to equity or adequacy or the property tax. None of those were deemed for the plan to be unconstitutional. Of course, the opinion itself was fairly scathing in terms of, hey, the formula isn't very good, okay, but the 9 judges aren't going to fix it. We need to send it back to the legislature for the legislature to look at it. Unfortunately for us, though, it does take a sense of urgency off the legislature. I mean, they do need to do something, and the new charges by the speaker in the meantime has said hey, look at it, but that doesn't always necessarily translate into action. So anyway, what can we do in the meantime? And so that's where we'll get into this discussion on a potential tax swap. But I guess before I get into that, I do want to address some of the actions we've been taking in the meantime. I'm a part of a group of CFOs that have been meeting on a regular basis since last fall, trying to put together a new funding formula. We are still going to submit a new funding formula. Now we'll have to find a rep to take it forward. Perhaps Jim Miller will take it forward for us. If not, we hopefully will be able to find someone else working with some of the other school districts. But I do think we are going to have enough common threads between the Texas School Alliance and the Equity Center, and then also TASB, in terms of what we think could be a common formula that we could submit. And so that's what we're doing from a political perspective. But again, as Ms. Edgar mentioned, we're planning for the worst. Okay, and so what could we do? So we do have some options that I think we need to consider. One of the things that we could do is actually do a tax swap, and this is very common with many other districts where they actually reduce the INS tax rate, but then they increase the M&O tax rate, but overall the tax rate stays the same. So right now we have $1.34 in terms of our tax rate. But if you add 2 pennies on the M&O side, each penny that we have right now, if we're at $33.8 billion, each penny is worth about $3.3 3.3, almost 3.4 million, almost. I mean, it's closer to 3.3 million. The pennies up to $1.06 are actually considered to be golden pennies. Those are pennies that are at the rate of Austin ISD. I don't know how they picked that. I just pick Austin ISD because I guess that's the one that's stone's throw from the Capitol. So anyway, they picked that, and so 2 pennies to us would mean just under $7 million. Okay, so if we had everybody paying the same tax rate, year over year, whenever we're talking about, and we're talking about the 17-18 budget. I'm not talking about this budget. I'm talking about planning. Okay, so that we would have an impact of $7 million, which is meaningful, very meaningful on the general fund side. So if you think about it, what would that mean? Okay, and so you have this. You'll probably have to look at the chart that you have in front of you. But when you compare that 2 pennies and keeping the rate the same, if you had that 2 pennies, basically the average taxpayer would be spending on an annual basis $47 more and just under $4 a month. Okay, if we kept those 2 pennies. Okay, and so again, we put together the initial recommendation of what we published. Again, because what we published had to be put together before the announcement that was put together. There's a long lead time to getting things into the paper and all of our planning. We'd always been planning on doing that 2 penny decrease, and so that's what we published. But what we're recommending is that we actually keep the tax rate the same this year, because what I don't want to do is I don't want to decrease it this year and then try to add to the tax rate next year, because it's very difficult to add to the tax rate. It's always easy to take away from the tax rate, and then unfortunately everybody doesn't always remember that the next year. Okay, and so what I would rather do is I would rather keep the tax rate the same this year. The next year, depending on what happens with the legislative session, by the time we'd have to make a decision on this next year, a legislative session should be in the books. I mean, it's supposed to end by June, by this time in 2017. And so I'd rather just keep the tax rate the same. We could we'd have about $6.5 million in local collections more. We can use that to pay off debt early in this current year, and then we would have the $1.34 tax rate going into our planning for next year, and we could see what happens with the legislative session. If we have a successful session, great. Maybe we just reduce the debt service rate at that time by 2 pennies, and then keep the M&O rate at $1.04. But if we don't have a favorable session, this may be something we want to do. Now, there's a kicker with this, though. Okay, here's the kicker. Even if we're keeping the tax rate the same, because we lowered the debt service rate and we're increasing the M&O rate, there's that swap. But anytime you try to add pennies to the M&O rate, we have to go back to our taxpayers in a tax ratification election. Okay? Now, the date of that election could be in 2017, pretty much any time between that August or maybe even earlier. We have to look at that. And we could have it as late as that November if we wanted to. We could have it on the general election date. I think it's more favorable to have it closer to the adoption of the actual tax rates earlier in the year from a planning perspective. But we would have to go through an election process to actually end up with a M&O tax rate of the $1.06. Okay, so that's what we'd be looking at. But again, we won't have to make the decision on this until we get a better idea of what's happening from a legislative perspective next spring. Okay, so anyway, kind of talked a lot about that, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. So what's happening in the future? So again, we have the adoption on the 20th and approval of the final amendments and the approval of the fund balance resolutions in July and August. We have to submit a Chapter 41 selection. We're still very, very far from recapture, but we still are technically now a Chapter 41 district, and so that requires some action. We'll be remarketing our 2015 A bonds. We'll be remarketing those early August. We'll be bringing all the agenda items for approval to get our commercial paper program in process. But if we are going to keep the tax rate the same, that's going to be higher than what we just got to finish publishing. So we're going to have to republish again. We'll have to run the truth in taxation calculations again. We would remarket the bonds and pay off that $7 million early, $6 to $7 million early, and that would justify having the 30 penny tax rate that we have in place now. And then we would have another tax rate hearing in September whenever the tax rate is adopted. And then we would also amend the debt service budget at that time to reflect the additional pennies. Okay, so that's really the way to get that done, and it's really just it's really just a strategic decision. Okay, that's really what we're getting at. I mean, can we afford to reduce the debt service tax rate at this time? The answer to that is unequivocally yes. Okay, is that the prudent thing to do given the recent ruling? And given the uncertainty with the legislative session, no, I don't think it's a prudent thing to do. I think it's prudent to wait, to pay off some debt early, see what happens with the legislative session, and then potentially do a tax swap in 2017. So that is the end of the presentation. We have the opportunity now for public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett. Do we have any questions from the trustees?
Yes.
Mr. Rice?
Thank you, Mr. Bassett. So I just wanted to repeat a couple of things I heard you say to make sure my understanding is correct. We've got the CAD appraisal value, which increased significantly last year, 15%. And 12 months later, the state recognizes the delta on that increase in taxes. And then they say, we're going to short you by a corresponding amount. We don't need to pay that anymore because you got it. But it comes at a bad time because the CAD appraisal values only increased 11% this year. So it's a double whammy. Now, is that what you mean by the CAD and the SEPTED is reversed?
Yes.
And I can't ever remember
Yes, sir.
what SEPTED stands for. Well,
It's CPTD, it's Comptroller
CPTD.
Property Tax Division.
okay, so.
It's the comptroller value
Okay.
versus the central appraisal district value.
So, and I saw in here that local property taxes for people interested in local control are 67%. So Fort Bend ISD is funded, 67% of its budget is funded by local property
Oh, yeah.
taxes.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
So I guess that would appeal to all the politicians who espouse that they are actually interested in local control. Of the $7,996 that we spend per student, how much of that comes from the state? Do you know offhand?
Well, we did that calculation based on the revenue, not necessarily based on the expenditure, but from a revenue perspective, our budget's expected to be 37% funded by the state,
Okay.
with 62% funded from locally.
All right, so I could just apply that ratio there
Yes, sir.
roughly.
Yes, sir.
So we're just under $600 million for our M&O. And if we're keeping 90 days, it's roughly $50 million a month.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit under that, which is why we're at 147 and 142.
Right.
That's a 92-day,
Mm-hmm.
and that's unassigned.
Mm-hmm.
We've got our own economic stabilization, our own rainy day fund through good stewardship. And that's going to carry us for the next couple of years. But also this is happening when we are increasing the number of students. We're increasing our costs because we have to build new schools and we have to hire new teachers to staff those schools and everything else. I guess we're getting some new buses, so we're replacing some buses, but some may be in addition to the fleet to accommodate the additional children that we have. And would I be correct in saying that if the CAD appraisal district increased in value year after year after year, theoretically, just hypothetically speaking, we could potentially reach a point where 100% of the cost of running this district would be borne by our local property taxes?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, that probably won't happen, but This always happens to us at the, it's great when everything's going up, and the minute it goes down, we really get hammered. So, and I know that we've already taken steps. We've had to terminate a proven program, a proven reading recovery program, because of the uncertainty with funding, and that's what every school district is trying to do, is maintain funding so we have sustainable programs that we can put in place year after year after year to meet the needs of our students. And we've done that in anticipation of this. I understand that you are talking about the various groups that you're in and the CFOs, and going to the state and trying to get a new, I guess, a better school finance program. I'm not as sanguine as you about its chances of success in the 85th legislative session. And so, one last question, and I'll yield the floor. I thought I heard you say that we had to, there's two things. What is recapture? What is the recapture you're referring to?
Okay, so if our wealth per WADA, so it's a weighted average ADA, if our wealth per WADA goes over 514,000 per student, and right now we're in the mid 300,000s. If we go over 514,000 per student, that means we'll be in the situation that Houston ISD is in, where they are sending money, they are sending locally collected taxpayer money to the state. So the Function 41 districts that are in recapture, that's what they're actually doing.
Okay, all right. We're not there yet, so that won't happen until we hit 500,000 wealth per student.
We
Right.
anticipate that to, not to occur until year 2025.
And that's under the current rules. Now, again, every time the basic allotment changes, and we do think there'll be a change of the basic allotment at some point, every time the basic allotment goes up, right now it's $5,140. If it went up to $5,200, well, then that recapture level moves up to $520,000. You know, so each year you got to look at these numbers again, because things are different. But you know, she's doing that projection, which is what all we can do is do based on what we know, and so she's doing that projection based on the basic allotment not changing.
Okay, very well. Then my other question was, I thought I heard you say that we have to advertise the debt service tax rate again,
Yes.
and so that would remain at 30 cents.
Right.
And why do we have to do that?
So the rules are, because we're actually having our budget hearing before we adopt the budget on June 20th. Okay, the rules are is that if we do want to change what the tax service rate from what we've published, not from what it is, but from what we publish, and we publish a tax rate of 28 pennies. If we do want to keep it at 30 pennies, we have to republish and have a hearing again. Okay, which isn't optimal. I mean, it's not something I'm looking forward to us doing, but I do think it's worth it given the circumstances, just to be able to maintain our strategic options going into next year.
Okay. Lastly, I would just like to make an editorial comment, and that is, I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to give our teachers a raise last year. They're the ones who bear the brunt of educating our kids every day, no matter what the state gives us or does not give us. They come to school every day prepared to teach our kids and make a difference in their lives. And I was listening to the radio today on, well, I'm not going to tell you what channel, but I heard Robert Sanborn with Children at Risk talking about how we need to hire better teachers. And I was really surprised to hear those comments. He is the gentleman and his organization who managed to give every school district in Region 4 a letter grade, and they're so good they don't even have to visit a school in order to do that. They don't have to visit or go into a classroom at all. They're so good at doing this, and they give us a letter grade, A through F. Now, of course, the state is going to do that too, but I would submit that if we want, there's a teacher shortage nationally. And small wonder, since every time you turn around, Teachers are getting beat up in the press by people who claim we're not doing a good job. And I beg to differ. I say we are doing a good job, and I would like to invite Mr. Sanborn and any other members of his organization to visit Fort Bend ISD schools and maybe just spend 30 minutes. I know they're busy people, but if they could spend 30 minutes in the classroom, they might have a change of heart. So I appreciate your comments. I'm going to yield the floor, and thank you for putting together a good budget, a good strategy going forward to protect our school district, especially in light of the fact that 86, almost 87% of our budget is spent on salaries and benefits, because teaching is a labor-intensive job. Children learn from teachers. They hug teachers. They don't hug computers. They hug teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Burdine?
Yes, Madam President. Mr. Bassett, on page number 4, under the revenue section, you had put instructional facility funds. I was curious about that. Where do we get that from?
That's an amount that I think it's $250 per student that that they allot to us whenever we open a new campus.
The state does?
The state does. Yeah, it's a small amount, but it's better than nothing. And so-
We get the funding for 2 years. The first year, we get it based on all the new students, and then the second year, we get it based on the increased number of students from the prior year.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I've lost my voice. So I'm gonna be quiet, but I wanted to make another comment. After the recent news of the funding of the lawsuit and the lower expected CAD growth, I support your conservative future planning and keeping the tax rate the same for the upcoming year. I do support a lower tax rate, and I would like us to revisit that in the future and see if that could be possible. But I think it's important for us to remain conservative and have options in the future. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. If we don't have Mrs. James?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate all the information. You commented when Mr. Rice was, or Mr. Rice mentioned about this, the revenue per student, and you talked about the revenue per student would be reduced 1.3% per student. Could you give us some numbers of what that is? If you have that, or if you don't have it now, you can send it to us. But I'm
Okay.
curious to know what that is, because as we try to advocate for state funding, it'll be important for us to use some real numbers to show what that means in terms of revenue per student.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think we just excluded it from this. I've been trying to keep the number of slides down, and so, anyway, but we'll have that. We'll be
Okay.
happy to send that.
Okay, thank you. And it may be in some of this information too, if I just am directed to the right page. And then I have a question also on about the 9.1 million surplus from this year.
Mhm.
That's those things that's the situation right at this moment. Is how I'm understanding that? And then those funds are going to be transferred out into the Economic Stabilization Fund, which is protecting us from this deficit we're expecting next year, or this reduction in funding for next year.
Exactly.
And into our major maintenance, so that when the HVAC goes out and whatnot, we have funding set aside to make those repairs and so forth.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so while it looks like we have a surplus, we're actually using that surplus to prepare ourselves next year for those shortfalls we're anticipating.
Exactly.
Okay, and then can you explain a little bit, you have a line item here of, is my time up?
Sorry. I was prepping.
You're practicing. Okay, well, that's all right. There's a line item, I think you said the other financial sources in the revenue line was from extended day and maybe athletic ticket sales and things like that. Is that accurate? Or?
Athletic ticket sales actually go into the general fund itself,
Okay.
just straight away. But the enterprise funds, which includes extended learning, and that's the biggest piece of it, we definitely, think that we'll be able to contribute at least 1.5 million from that enterprise fund into the general fund next year.
Okay, and that fund contributed about $1 million this year?
That's in the plan right now. That's right.
That's what you estimate?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is basically then from the enterprise funds? is
Yes, ma'am.
what you're saying? Okay. Thank you. And I guess I agree with what you said, Jason, about the tax rate. It's kind of disappointing. We looked forward to that. We thought that was a really positive step that we could take. So it's sort of disappointing to realize that maybe we can't do that or we shouldn't do that it's not good financial planning. And I guess I think I need to ponder that a little bit more to fully sort of digest the pros and cons. I basically understand what the situation is, so thank you for bringing that information to us tonight.
No, it's no problem. I mean, we'll adopt we anticipate you adopting the budget as is with the 28 pennies, okay, when we meet on the 20th. And that's fine. So we could stick with the 28 pennies, but if we decide that the 30 pennies is what we want to do from a strategic perspective, then that's when we can talk about it again in July when we meet, but then we would want to have a republication in August and then another meeting before we would make a decision when the tax rate was actually adopted in September. So there's time to think about this. This isn't a decision that has to be made tonight. I know this is it's a little bit of a radical concept, and I am personally disappointed as well, to be able to say that, hey, we're doing all these bond things, whatever, and we're reducing the tax rate. That would have been great for our district to be able to claim. But that's just on the debt service side, and the bigger picture is really on the general fund side, which is where we need this benefit.
Right, so I understand that. So though we would be adopting the budget at our regular meeting, the tax rate we don't actually adopt until normally in September, I think. Is that
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
So we have some time, and then, as you described, we would make a budget amendment to the debt service budget at that time. If
That's
we,
exactly right.
chose to keep it the same, if you will.
Mhm.
So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. James. And do we have any other, Ms. Hilliker?
I think I would tend to agree with Ms. James, is that I think our hands were tied here, and I think the public needs to understand the reason if we decide to go with the 30 cents. And I'm not sure with the publication that we do we offer pros and cons to the differences if we're going to do the 30 cents? Do we offer that as part of communication? I'm not sure what that communication.
We'll certainly have a communication challenge, to talk about this. In terms of the publication, the publication itself that goes into the paper is prescribed by law. Specific tables with specific language that we're not allowed to modify.
Okay.
And so if we decide to republish, then we'll have to go through from a communication perspective to explain what we're thinking and what we're doing, and it'll include a lot of the same language that you have in the memo that we sent at the end of last week. But then we'll have to think of what other questions we have in the meantime, put together some kind of FAQ or whatever. But we will have a communication challenge between now and then, September, whenever we would actually adopt the rate, and then we'll see what happens with the legislative session. If that goes well, we may not have to have an election. We could just reduce the rate and be fine that next year. But then if we do have to have an election, that's a whole other communication process we'd have to go through.
Thank you.
The actual publication is on page 20 in the book that you have.
Yeah, I saw the publication, but I was wanting more of a, like you said, a FAQ, because, I think everyone has been, anticipating a price reduction, especially with the increase of property values, so.
Right.
Thank you, Ms. Hilliker. I would concur. That was going to be my comment, is I'd like to see us get out there and educate the public if this is something that we decide we want to do going forward. Okay, so I think it's time for public comment. I'd like to say thank.
Mrs. Tosin,
Oh, sorry, yes.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Rice, go
I
ahead.
always have a lot to say on this, but Mr. Bassett, I heard you say that the 2 pennies would generate additional revenue of just under $7 million. So they're not golden pennies like the $1.04 is. They're lead pennies or dross pennies, right?
Well, actually, those 2 pennies on the general fund side, up to $1.06, are golden pennies. So
Up
those
to $1.06?
if we go up to $1.06, those are the golden pennies.
And what if we go over that amount?
Well, I knew we'd get that question. If we go over, if we start adding pennies above $1.06, again, all that has to be done in election. That's where we get into the quote-unquote copper pennies. Copper pennies, it's a different calculation, and each penny, if you go to $1.07, $1.08, $1.09, each penny is actually worth a different amount. But it's in between 2.5 and $3 million per
Okay.
penny.
So, and I'm not suggesting that we do that, but here's my question. For our so-called copper pennies, I prefer to call them lead pennies. That's a filter. That's a filter that the state puts on. So who derives the benefit on the input side of the filter? Does the state get that benefit?
Well, what's interesting is that, if our collections are closer to the, 3.3 million per penny, okay, then what happens is if our tax rate does increase beyond the $1.06, for every penny, that difference between the 3.3 that we're collecting locally and the 2.5 or 2.6 that we would actually receive, that is money that the state keeps through recapture.
Okay, and so would it be wrong for me to suggest that the state would actually profit or benefit from us having a TRE that exceeded $1.06?
That is correct.
How ironic. Thank you very much.
Sounds a little like a state property tax. Okay. Are we ready to move into public comment? Okay, we have one member of the audience signed up, Rodrigo Carrion. Mr. Carrion, if you'll step to the microphone, make sure it's turned on for you. I think you need to, sir, you need to make sure it's, there we go. And Ms. Helliger's gonna time you, 3 minutes, and she'll let you know when you have 30 seconds left, and I think her phone will chime when the time is up.
Okay, after what we're hearing, I support the school district to keep those 2 additional pennies, what is it, 130, not to bring the rates down, because what is this? Our state appraisal is going beyond the law. They're overvaluing our properties beyond their limit, taking advantage of residents. Residents and these flood rates will only benefit commercial properties, which is not fair. We're going to get our state lawmakers or legislatures to bring in revenue one way or another to help our school districts. And plus also been concerned about these private school buses roaming around my area over here on the east side, named Gold Star Transit. What's the purpose of hiring a private school bus? Well, don't we have enough bus drivers or school buses to transfer our students to our schools day and night, for the morning and the afternoon? Because it happened all year for this 2015-16. The buses Golden Star, picking them up and dropping them out, picking them up. And I was wondering, where's Forbin ISD buses? And because to me, it looks like it's more expensive and wasting more money paying for a private company, school bus company, than our own bus drivers. So if we need to use that fund, let's pay our bus drivers more money so they can keep the job and do the work fairly and equally, just like our teachers and administrators. Yeah, they need a pay raise to make them take advantage and enjoy their job and get the job done, and not depend on somebody else privately. Just like also these lawmakers, these lawyers, Limbarger, Guggen, Blair. It's a private lawyer, but it was like bringing like a suit to me. What is this? According to somebody else's property. How can a private lawyer be putting my name in somebody else's property, or adding me as if I was a member or owner? To me, that's totally wrong. So I'll let you keep that. That way, if you're paying this lawyer privately, under your pocket, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. Make sure it's not higher. Make sure you fire them. Because that's wasting revenue, taxpayer revenue, paying these private lawyers and these private companies, which is not fun. So we need to keep a close eye where our money's going. Make sure we get it for our private individuals, public workers, and staff members. Okay? That's my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carrion. Mr. Rice, if you want to, we can pass that to Mrs. Kaiser. And okay. Do we have any other members of the audience that would like to speak? Okay. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Okay, we're going to adjourn for about 5 minutes until 6:30, and then we'll come back out and start our regular workshop meeting.